Emma Brooks walked through the bustling streets of downtown, her heart light and her mind focused on one thing: finding the perfect birthday gift for her mom. At 22, she was nearing the end of her college years, full of dreams and aspirations, yet still grounded by the love and wisdom her mother had always shared with her. Today was special, and Emma wanted to show her appreciation for all the sacrifices her mom had made over the years. As she strolled past the chic boutiques, her eyes caught the shimmering window display of a high-end jewelry store. The sparkling gems and delicate designs seemed to call out to her, and she felt a flutter of excitement in her chest. She had never spent much on gifts before, but this time, she wanted it to be different, something truly special. Taking a deep breath, she pushed open the door to the store. A little bell chimed as she entered, and the cool air inside offered a sharp contrast to the warmth of the sun outside. The store was quiet, elegant, and calming, everything she had hoped for. She wandered through the aisles, admiring the gleaming necklaces and bracelets. "Can I help you, miss?" A kind voice interrupted her thoughts. Emma turned to see a friendly young woman standing behind the counter. "Oh yes, please," Emma smiled, her excitement building. "I'm looking for a birthday gift for my mom." The woman's smile widened as she stepped forward, eager to help. "How thoughtful. Do you have something in mind?" Emma bit her lip, thinking. She loves necklaces, and her favorite color is blue. As Emma browsed through the display cases, she couldn't help but smile to herself. The store was filled with glimmering jewels, each piece seemingly more beautiful than the last. But what truly caught her attention were the delicate necklaces, a perfect match for her mom's love of timeless, elegant pieces. She wondered which one would capture her mother's heart and show her just how much she was appreciated. "Can I help you find something?" A voice interrupted her thoughts. Emma looked up to see a friendly sales associate, a woman in her mid-20s with short brown hair and an easy smile. Her name tag read Sarah. Emma nodded, feeling a bit relieved. "Yes, actually, I'm looking for a birthday gift for my mom. She loves necklaces, and her favorite color is blue." Sarah's eyes lit up. "That's such a sweet idea," she said warmly, leading Emma to a case filled with intricate silver and sapphire necklaces. "This one might be perfect. It has that royal blue hue, and the design is quite unique." Emma's fingers hovered over the sparkling pieces as Sarah explained the details of each necklace. Emma was touched by the thoughtfulness in Sarah's voice. As she listened to Sarah describe the beauty of the jewelry, Emma's mind wandered to her mom. She thought about all the little things her mother had done for her, how she always put her family first, how she stayed up late helping with school projects, and how she never complained. Her father, James Brooks, had always taught her to show love through actions, not just words. This necklace wasn't just a gift. It was a symbol of everything her mom had given her. She wanted to make her proud. "Your mom is lucky to have such a caring daughter," Sarah said with a smile, noticing the look of tenderness on Emma's face. Emma felt a warm flush spread across her cheeks. "Thank you. My dad always says it's important to show people how much we care, not just tell them." Sarah nodded. "Your dad sounds like a wise man." Emma smiled, her heart swelling with pride as she thought of her father. This gift wasn't just about buying something beautiful. It was about expressing her love for her mom in a meaningful way, just as her father had always taught her. As Emma continued to peruse the display cases, her excitement began to rise again. She couldn't help but imagine the look on her mother's face when she received the beautiful necklace. The thought of her mother's smile made the experience feel even more special. She lightly touched the delicate blue pendant that Sarah had pointed out earlier, admiring its subtle elegance. It was exactly what she had in mind, a perfect combination of sophistication and simplicity. But as Emma reached for it, she felt a strange sensation creeping up her spine. It wasn't anything she could pinpoint at first, but there was something in the air, something out of place. Emma's gaze shifted upward, and she caught sight of a woman standing near the far end of the store. The woman was tall and impeccably dressed, her expensive-looking suit contrasting sharply with the other customers' casual attire. She had a cold, calculating look in her eyes that immediately made Emma feel uneasy. The woman didn't approach, but Emma could feel her eyes fixed on her. It was the kind of stare that seemed to go straight through her, almost as though she was being judged. Emma tried to ignore the discomfort bubbling in her stomach, focusing instead on the necklace in her hand. But it was hard to concentrate when she felt so scrutinized. Emma instinctively took a small step back, her eyes still drawn to the woman who appeared completely unbothered by the attention she was directing toward Emma. The woman's gaze never wavered, and Emma felt her pulse quicken. She was suddenly hyper-aware of the space around her. The store, which had felt so warm and welcoming moments ago, now seemed like a cold, sterile place. She couldn't shake the feeling that something was very wrong. She turned her attention back to the necklace in her hand, but when she glanced toward the counter, she noticed that the woman was now speaking to one of the employees behind the register. Emma's eyes followed the employee's line of sight, only to find that the young man had cast a quick, suspicious glance toward her before nodding in response to the woman's whisper. The exchange was brief, but enough to send a wave of anxiety through Emma's chest. Trying to shake off the feeling, Emma carefully placed the necklace back on the display and stepped away. She glanced at Sarah, but the sales associate was busy with another customer. Emma couldn't help but notice that the woman's eyes were still locked onto her as she continued to converse quietly with the employee. It wasn't just the woman's presence that made Emma feel uncomfortable. It was the sense that she was being watched, judged, as though she didn't belong there. Her fingers began to tremble slightly, and she quickly shoved them into her jacket pockets, attempting to steady herself. Despite her discomfort, Emma refused to let the woman's gaze control her. She had every right to be in that store. She was just looking for a gift, a simple act of kindness for the woman who had done so much for her. But the longer the woman lingered, the more Emma felt like an outsider, like she was being unfairly targeted for reasons she couldn't understand. It was as though she wasn't allowed to enjoy this moment, to do something nice for the person who had always been there for her. Taking a deep breath, Emma tried to shake off the unease. She would not let this woman ruin the day. She would focus on the gift, on her mother, and on what really mattered. But deep down, Emma couldn't help but wonder what was going on, and whether she would ever truly understand the reason behind the strange encounter. Emma's heart raced as she carefully placed the blue pendant back onto its velvet cushion. Her hands were shaking, and the warmth she had felt earlier seemed to evaporate into a cool, unsettling anxiety. She moved quickly away from the display case, her eyes darting toward the door, but before she could even make it to the exit, the sound of heavy footsteps approaching her made her freeze. "Excuse me, miss, stop right there." Emma turned around to find a tall, imposing officer standing behind her, his uniform sharply pressed and his badge gleaming in the store's soft lighting. His face was set in a hard frown, and his posture was stiff, almost as if he were ready for a confrontation. He was in his mid-40s, with short-cropped hair and a serious, no-nonsense demeanor. He moved closer, his eyes narrowing as he spoke again, this time with more authority in his voice. "I'm Officer Cole, and I need to ask you some questions," he said firmly. "There's been a report of a stolen necklace from this store, and you're the one who was near the display when it went missing." Emma's stomach dropped. The last thing she expected after such a pleasant shopping trip was to be accused of theft. Her mind raced in confusion, unable to comprehend what was happening. She took a step back, her voice trembling as she tried to explain herself. "But I didn't take anything," Emma protested, her hands instinctively reaching to pull her jacket closed as if to protect herself from the sudden tension. "I was just looking for a gift for my mom. I didn't steal anything." Officer Cole's eyes didn't soften. In fact, they hardened even further, and he stepped closer. "That's what they all say," he muttered, almost dismissively, as if he had already made up his mind about her guilt. "Empty your pockets, please, miss." Emma felt her chest tighten as her hands fumbled nervously at the zipper of her jacket. She had nothing to hide, but the officer's aggressive tone and the growing crowd of onlookers surrounding her made it feel like the walls were closing in. Her fingers shook as she pulled open the pockets of her jacket and, with a helpless glance at the growing crowd outside, showed that they were empty. "I swear, I didn't take anything," Emma repeated, her voice breaking. Her face burned with embarrassment as she noticed people on the street staring, their whispers cutting through the air like knives. "I'm just here to buy a gift for my mom. Please, you have to believe me." But instead of showing sympathy, Officer Cole's expression became even more stern. "Where did you hide it?" he pressed. "In your bag? Your shoes? Your jacket?" Emma's breathing quickened, and she felt the weight of the situation crashing down on her. Her hands trembled as she clutched her purse to her chest. The officer's accusations felt like a slow suffocation, the breath being knocked out of her with every word. "I want to call my dad," Emma managed to say, her voice a mere whisper. Officer Cole didn't give her a chance to protest. "You can call your dad from the station," he said, and his tone left no room for negotiation. "Now, hand over your bag." Tears stung at the corners of Emma's eyes. She was being treated like a criminal for no reason at all. All she had wanted was to find the perfect gift for her mother. But instead, she was standing there, accused of theft in front of a growing crowd of strangers. The whispers grew louder, and Emma felt every pair of eyes on her, condemning her, judging her. "I swear, I didn't do anything," Emma repeated, but it was as if her words fell on deaf ears. The more she tried to explain, the more the officer seemed determined to prove her guilty. Just when she felt completely trapped in the web of injustice, a voice broke through the tension. "What's going on here?" Emma's heart leapt as she turned to see a tall man walking toward her, his steps confident and firm. The crowd parted as the man made his way through, and as he approached, Emma's eyes widened with relief. It was her father, James Brooks, looking every bit the protective figure she had known all her life. His expression was a mix of concern and anger as he reached Emma's side and placed a reassuring arm around her shoulders. "I'm Mason Brooks, FBI," he said calmly but firmly as he flashed his badge. "What's the meaning of this, officer?" Emma's breath caught in her throat as she stood next to her father, feeling the immediate relief that his presence brought. He had always been her rock, and now, once again, he was here to protect her. The crowd began to disperse, murmuring amongst themselves as Emma clung to her father, her chest still heaving with the weight of the encounter. Despite the tension that had gripped her heart only moments before, she felt a sense of relief flood her body. Her father was here, and with him, a sense of security that she had always known. Mason Brooks, her dad, was a force to be reckoned with, calm under pressure, authoritative in his manner, and relentless when it came to protecting those he loved. Mason stood firm, his eyes trained on Officer Cole, who was now beginning to realize that the situation had escalated far beyond what he had anticipated. The officer's earlier bravado was replaced with a flicker of hesitation. He took a step back, but Mason's calm, unyielding gaze stopped him in his tracks. "What's going on here, officer?" Mason's voice was controlled, but there was no mistaking the authority it carried. "You're accusing my daughter of theft without any evidence? Do you have a warrant, or are you just operating on suspicion and assumptions?" Cole's face flushed, his pride struggling to maintain its grip. "This young woman was seen near a display of a stolen necklace," he muttered, his voice defensive. "We received a report, and I was simply following procedure." "Following procedure?" Mason's voice grew firmer, his patience wearing thin. "That's not enough. A report is not evidence, and accusations without cause are not procedure. They're harassment. Did you even check the security footage or speak to anyone who can confirm your story? Or were you too busy making assumptions based on what? Her appearance? The color of her skin?" Emma's breath caught in her throat. She had been so caught up in the moment, so focused on her own helplessness, that it hadn't fully occurred to her how quickly things had spiraled out of control. But now, standing next to her father, she felt the weight of the injustice more keenly than ever. "Sweetheart, did you take anything from this store?" Mason asked softly, turning to Emma. She shook her head vigorously, the tears that had welled in her eyes now threatening to fall. "No, Dad," she said in a cracked voice. "I swear I didn't." Mason nodded, then turned his attention back to Officer Cole. "My daughter says she didn't steal anything, and she's the only one who matters in this situation. You have no evidence to the contrary. I demand that you release her immediately." The tension between Mason and Officer Cole was thick, the silence punctuated only by the distant hum of the city and the soft murmur of the remaining bystanders. For a long moment, Cole said nothing, his jaw clenching as he considered his options. Finally, his radio crackled to life, a voice coming through, ordering him to return to the precinct. Mason raised an eyebrow. "Looks like you've been called away, officer." "How convenient." Cole cleared his throat, clearly rattled by the unexpected turn of events. "This isn't over," he muttered, before turning on his heel and walking away, his posture stiff with embarrassment and frustration. Emma felt her body relax as her father wrapped an arm around her shoulders. She closed her eyes for a moment, letting the warmth of his embrace wash over her. She had felt so small, so vulnerable, just moments before. But now, with her father beside her, the sense of relief was overwhelming. "You're safe now," Mason said quietly, rubbing her back in small circles. "It's okay. I don't understand, Dad," Emma whispered, her voice trembling. "Why did he treat me like that? I didn't do anything wrong." Mason's jaw tightened. "I don't know, sweetheart. But I'll find out. This isn't just about you anymore. It's about something bigger. Something that goes beyond this store, beyond that officer. I'm going to get to the bottom of it." As they walked back toward their car, Mason couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. The interaction with Officer Cole had been strange, but it was more than that. He was a seasoned FBI agent, someone who had investigated countless cases, seen all manner of wrongdoing, and he could sense when something was off. Back at the car, Mason made a few quick calls. He had contacts in law enforcement, in the city, and within the FBI. His mind was already working, running through the details, piecing things together. He needed to know more about the store, the incident, and the officer. Emma sat in the passenger seat, her hands folded tightly in her lap as she stared out the window, lost in thought. Mason could see the confusion in her eyes, the disbelief. This was supposed to be a simple trip, a chance to find a beautiful gift for her mother. But now, their lives had been thrust into something much darker, something more sinister. "Don't worry," Mason said, glancing over at Emma. "I'll take care of this. We'll clear your name, and we'll figure out why this happened. No one's going to get away with this." Emma gave a small nod, but her mind was already racing. The whispers, the suspicious looks, the cold stares. The way Officer Cole had treated her, and the way he had assumed guilt simply because of how she looked. It wasn't just about the necklace. It was about something much deeper. Mason's mind raced as he drove through the city, his thoughts consumed by the events that had unfolded. He had been in law enforcement long enough to know when something wasn't right, and the way Officer Cole had behaved, so eager to accuse his daughter without any solid evidence, troubled him deeply. It wasn't just a random mistake or a misunderstanding. Something more was at play here, and Mason was determined to find out what. Back at home, Mason immediately got to work. He started by reviewing the events of the day in his mind, trying to piece together every detail. He remembered the woman in the jewelry store, the one who had stared at Emma with such intensity, whispering something to the staff. Emma had mentioned her name, Mrs. Ford, and Mason felt an instinctive knot tighten in his stomach. He had to find out more about her. Mason knew the importance of information, and he knew how to dig for it. He picked up the phone and called a few of his trusted colleagues in law enforcement. He needed to track down Mrs. Ford and learn about her possible connections to Officer Cole and the jewelry store. As he waited for the information to come in, his thoughts drifted back to Emma's face, the way she had looked so lost and scared when she was accused. No child should ever have to feel that way. A few hours later, Mason had gathered enough information to start drawing connections. Mrs. Ford wasn't just any ordinary customer at the jewelry store. She was well known in the local community, particularly for her involvement with the high-end retail industry. But Mason's research revealed something more troubling. She had a history of making false accusations of theft, particularly against young black individuals. This was not the first time her claims had led to police intervention, and Mason's suspicions began to grow. He spent the next few hours tracking down security footage from the jewelry store. He was fortunate enough to have a contact within the store who was willing to assist him in retrieving the video. When the footage arrived, Mason pored over it carefully. What he saw made his stomach churn. Mrs. Ford had been in the store during Emma's visit, and she had been watching her closely. In fact, it appeared as though Mrs. Ford had been the one to alert the staff about Emma, pointing her out and insisting that she looked suspicious. It was then that Mason realized the truth. This wasn't just about a missing necklace. It was part of a pattern, a scheme that Mrs. Ford had orchestrated. She had targeted Emma, perhaps because of her appearance, perhaps because of her race, or maybe just because she was an easy target in a place of privilege. It wasn't just racial profiling. It was a deliberate attempt to ruin the life of an innocent young woman. With the evidence in hand, Mason knew it was time to act. He could no longer wait. He needed to confront Mrs. Ford and Officer Cole directly. He wasn't going to let them get away with this. But before he could make any further moves, he received an unexpected call. It was from the store manager, Mr. Allen. "Agent Brooks," Mr. Allen said, his voice tight with nervousness. "I've been thinking about what happened earlier today, and I've got some information that might help you." Mason felt a surge of hope. "Go on," he said, his voice steady but intense. "It's about Mrs. Ford," Mr. Allen continued. "I didn't realize it at first, but she's been causing trouble for a while. She's made a habit of reporting false thefts to us, especially when it involves young black customers. I didn't want to say anything before, but I don't want to be part of this anymore. I've seen her do it before, and I didn't stop her." Mason was silent for a moment, letting the weight of the information sink in. "Thank you for coming forward," he said, his voice low with gratitude. "I'm going to take this to the police." As Mason hung up the phone, a wave of anger and resolve washed over him. He knew that he had to expose Mrs. Ford for what she truly was: a manipulator, someone who had used her position of influence to ruin the lives of innocent people. And Officer Cole was complicit in this, whether he realized it or not. Mason's next step was clear. He needed to bring all the evidence together and confront both Mrs. Ford and Officer Cole. He wasn't going to let this go until they faced justice. He knew the path ahead would be difficult. Powerful people like Mrs. Ford didn't go down easily. But Mason had one thing on his side that they didn't. He had the truth, and he would stop at nothing to make sure it came to light. The next day, Mason sat at his desk, staring at the array of documents and evidence he had gathered over the past 24 hours. He felt the weight of his decision press down on him. The deeper he dug, the more disturbing the reality became. This was no isolated incident. It was part of a far-reaching scheme to target young black people, use them as scapegoats, and exploit the justice system for personal gain. Mason knew that taking action against Mrs. Ford, Officer Cole, and the jewelry store would not be easy. Powerful people had been involved, and this could escalate in ways he couldn't predict. But his resolve remained unshaken. He couldn't let this go. Not for his daughter, not for the countless others who had been wronged, and not for the integrity of the system he had dedicated his life to protecting. The call came just as Mason was preparing to leave his office. It was from his colleague, Agent Elena Morales. "I've got the details you asked for," Elena said, her voice firm and no nonsense. "It's worse than we thought. Officer Cole's brother, Lucas, is more deeply involved in this than we realized." Mason sat up straight, a chill running down his spine. "How so?" "It turns out Lucas has represented Mrs. Ford in several legal matters over the years. From what we can tell, he's been helping her cover up her schemes, making sure they stay under the radar. His brother's connections could explain why Cole was so eager to target your daughter." Mason's fingers tightened around the edge of his desk, his knuckles turning white. "I knew there was something off about this whole thing. Lucas was playing his part, but I didn't know the full extent of his involvement. And Cole, he was too quick to act without even asking the right questions." Elena's voice softened slightly. "We've got the proof we need now, Mason. You've been patient, but you need to move quickly. Mrs. Ford has a history of pulling strings, and if you don't act fast, she could slip away." Mason exhaled slowly, his gaze fixed on the evidence in front of him. He knew Elena was right. This was his moment. It was time to bring everything to light and expose the corruption at the heart of this case. "I'm on it. I'll meet you at the precinct in an hour," Mason said, hanging up the phone. He stood up from his desk, his mind already racing with plans. He had one last card to play, one final confrontation to bring the truth into the open. He needed to act quickly, decisively, and with unwavering strength. When he arrived at the precinct, the mood was tense. Elena met him at the door, her expression serious. "You ready for this?" she asked. "As ready as I'll ever be," Mason replied, his voice calm but filled with determination. "Let's bring them to justice." Elena led Mason into the interrogation room, where Officer Cole was waiting. He looked disheveled, uncomfortable in his seat, his eyes darting around the room nervously. When he saw Mason, his jaw tightened, and his posture stiffened. "Mason, I wasn't expecting you," Cole said, trying to hide the unease in his voice. "This is unnecessary." Mason didn't waste time with pleasantries. He slammed a folder full of evidence onto the table in front of Cole, the impact causing the officer to flinch. "You've been caught, Cole. I've got the proof. I know about your brother's involvement with Mrs. Ford and her schemes. I know you were pressured to make false accusations against my daughter. And I know this is bigger than just one incident." Cole swallowed hard, his face draining of color. "I didn't mean for things to go this far," he stammered, his voice trembling. "I didn't realize how deep it was. Mrs. Ford, she's connected. She told me if I helped her, She could make things go away for me. I never thought it would end up like this. Mason leaned forward, his gaze hard and unyielding. You made the wrong choice, officer. And now you're going to face the consequences. You put my daughter through hell for nothing. You targeted her because of who she is and what she looked like. And you thought you could get away with it. Cole's face twisted with shame and guilt. I didn't know what else to do. She had leverage on me. I was trying to protect my career. But now I see. I've ruined everything. Mason's anger flared, but he forced himself to stay calm. It's not just your career that's on the line, Cole. You've hurt people. You've damaged the very fabric of trust that law enforcement is supposed to uphold. And you can't just walk away from that. Elena stepped in, her voice stern. We're not here to offer you a way out, Cole. You've crossed a line. And now, we're going to make sure you answer for everything you've done. Cole's shoulders slumped, and he lowered his gaze, defeated. I'm sorry. I should have never done it. Mason stood up, his gaze still fixed on Cole. Sorry doesn't cut it. But you will have to answer for your actions in court. As Mason and Elena left the interrogation room, the weight of the confrontation lingered on him. He knew that this was just the beginning. The road ahead would be difficult, filled with legal battles and challenges, but the truth was now out in the open. Mrs. Ford's manipulation was exposed, and Officer Cole would be held accountable for his role in the scheme. But Mason wasn't done yet. He still needed to confront Mrs. Ford herself. The battle wasn't over, but for the first time, Mason felt the tide beginning to turn in his favor. The day of the final confrontation had arrived, and Mason could feel the tension in the air. Everything had been leading up to this moment. He had spent countless hours collecting evidence, speaking with witnesses, and piecing together the corruption that had tainted not only the jewelry store, but the law enforcement officer who had been complicit in the scheme. But it wasn't enough to just expose the truth. He needed to bring Mrs. Ford to justice. Mason sat in his car outside her home, his fingers drumming anxiously against the steering wheel. This wasn't just about his daughter anymore. This was about the larger, systemic issues that had allowed people like Mrs. Ford to manipulate the justice system for their own gain. He knew it wouldn't be easy. Mrs. Ford had power, influence, and connections that could make this battle far more complicated than it already was. But Mason wasn't backing down. He had spent hours preparing for this day, gathering his team, organizing all the pieces of the puzzle. The connections between Mrs. Ford, Officer Cole, and the jewelry store were undeniable now. They had used Emma as a pawn in a much larger game, one that involved racial profiling, insurance fraud, and a complete disregard for justice. But today, Mason was going to put an end to it. He reached for his phone and dialed Elena's number. It's time, he said, his voice low but filled with certainty. Meet me at the jewelry store in 30 minutes. We have to move quickly. The response was swift. I'm on my way, Elena replied. We'll make sure this ends today. Mason took one last look at Mrs. Ford's house. He didn't know what kind of person she was behind closed doors, but he had seen enough of her manipulation to know that she would fight tooth and nail to protect her interests. The only way to break through that facade was to confront her head-on. And that was exactly what Mason planned to do. When Mason arrived at the jewelry store, Elena was already waiting outside. She gave him a nod, and together, they made their way inside. The store was quiet, the usual hum of conversation and laughter absent. There was a coldness in the air, a palpable sense of anticipation. They had been waiting for this moment, and now the time had come to face the woman who had caused so much pain. Mrs. Ford was at the counter, her back turned as she conversed with the manager, Mr. Allen. As Mason approached, he could see the way the manager stiffened when he caught sight of him. Mr. Allen's nervousness was evident, and Mason couldn't help but wonder how much he knew about what had really been going on in this place. Mrs. Ford, Mason said, his voice steady and commanding. We need to talk. She turned, her face hardening when she saw him. There was no recognition of wrongdoing, no shame in her expression, only defiance. Agent Brooks, she said, her tone icy. What a surprise. I assume you're here to make more baseless accusations. Mason didn't flinch. This isn't about accusations. This is about the truth. And I'm here to make sure you face the consequences for what you've done. Mrs. Ford's eyes narrowed, but she didn't back down. You have no idea what you're talking about. I've done nothing wrong. I don't have to explain myself to you or anyone else. Elena stepped forward, her gaze sharp. We know everything, Mrs. Ford. We know about your history of false accusations, your manipulation of Officer Cole, and your involvement in this theft scheme. The truth is out, and you can't hide behind your wealth and connections anymore. The color drained from Mrs. Ford's face. For the first time, there was a flicker of doubt in her eyes. But she quickly regained her composure, crossing her arms defensively. I don't know what you think you have, but you won't get away with this. Do you really think the authorities will listen to a disgruntled agent and a couple of criminals with an agenda? Mason's voice was unwavering. It's not just me, Mrs. Ford. You're not dealing with one person. We have evidence, we have witnesses, and we have the law on our side. It's over. The tension in the room was thick, but it wasn't just about confrontation anymore. It was about bringing down someone who had abused the system for far too long. Mrs. Ford's facade was cracking, her confidence faltering as the weight of her actions pressed down on her. You're wrong, she whispered, her voice trembling for the first time. I didn't mean for it to go this far. I just needed the money. Mason's eyes softened for a moment. You hurt people, Mrs. Ford. You ruined lives, including my daughter's. And for what? Money? Power? No one is above the law, not even you. Mrs. Ford's silence was deafening. She stood there, her face pale, as if processing everything she had done. Mason could see that her defenses were crumbling, and the moment of reckoning had arrived. Elena stepped forward, a sense of finality in her tone. We're turning over all the evidence to the authorities, Mrs. Ford. There's no running from this. You're going to face the consequences, whether you like it or not. Mrs. Ford's shoulders slumped, her mask slipping as the weight of her actions became undeniable. As the police arrived to take her into custody, Mason and Elena stood together, knowing that this victory wasn't just for Emma. It was for every other person who had suffered under the same corrupt system. In the days following Mrs. Ford's arrest, the city buzzed with news of the scandal. The once esteemed jewelry store was now under investigation for its role in the theft schemes, and Officer Cole faced disciplinary action for his involvement. Mason had known that bringing down such powerful figures would have far-reaching consequences, but he hadn't anticipated just how deep the corruption ran. As the media coverage continued, it became clear that what had started as a personal vendetta against his daughter had exposed a systemic issue that affected more than just their lives. Mason sat in his office, reviewing reports and witness statements, his mind still processing everything that had happened. It had been a long road to get here, and the truth had come out, but the battle wasn't over. He still had to face the fallout of exposing such a deeply embedded network of corruption. His phone rang, pulling him from his thoughts. It was Elena. Mason, she said, her voice sounding both relieved and triumphant. We did it. The charges against Officer Cole have been filed, and the department is moving forward with a full investigation into the jewelry store. Mrs. Ford's connections have been severed. We're one step closer to justice. Mason leaned back in his chair, allowing himself a moment of quiet satisfaction. It's not just about the big names, Elena. We've shown that no one is above the law. This was about making sure people like my daughter and countless others are never treated like that again. Elena's voice softened. I couldn't have said it better myself, Mason. But you did more than that. You've given people hope, shown them that standing up for what's right can lead to real change. This is just the beginning. Mason nodded. He knew this victory wasn't just his. It belonged to everyone who had been hurt by this system, to every person who had been falsely accused or marginalized. But as he looked out of his office window, he realized that there was still work to be done. Change had begun, but it would take time for the wounds to heal. Mason wasn't about to rest until he knew that justice had truly been served, for his daughter, for the community, and for the countless others who had been victims of injustice.